The moment Rosa Redmond realized she was going to die in the Arizona desert, she was not thinking about water. She was thinking about the letter she had never sent. It had been folded inside her coat pocket for 3 weeks, pressed flat against her ribs like a second heartbeat, addressed to a man she no longer wished to marry. The irony was not lost on her. Even now, with the sun hammering down on the cracked earth beneath her boots, and her throat so dry that swallowing had become a private act of suffering. She had ridden all this way across 4 states to escape a future that had been chosen for her, only to end up dying in the most spectacular, God-forsaken stretch of nowhere the good Lord had ever created. The year was 1873, and the Arizona Territory was not yet a forgiving place for anyone, let alone a woman traveling alone. Rosa had left Abilene, Kansas on a Tuesday in late April, which was already foolish. She had planned to join a wagon company heading southwest, but a miscommunication at the last stage depot had left her stranded with her horse, her saddlebags, and an overly optimistic map drawn by a man who had never actually walked the route himself. The map showed a water stop called Cutter's Well, which Rosa had circled in pencil and trusted completely. Cutter's Well, it turned out, had dried up 2 summers ago, and nobody had bothered to update the map. Her horse, a stubborn roan mare she'd named Pepper, had given out near the base of a ridge 2 days back. Rosa had walked since then, carrying what she could and leaving the rest. She had rationed her canteen carefully, but carefully had not been carefully enough. The last drop had been gone since morning, and now the sun was past its peak, and the landscape around her was nothing but pale rock and brittle scrub, and the occasional skeleton of something that had once hoped for better. She sat down in the narrow shade of a boulder, pulled off her hat and pressed it against her chest. Her dark hair was damp with perspiration. Her lips were cracked. She was 24 years old, educated enough to recognize the symptoms of severe dehydration, and stubborn enough to still be angry about the situation rather than simply frightened. Anger, she had found, kept a person moving longer than fear. She had managed, by some miracle of determination, to climb to the top of the ridge just before sundown, and it was from that vantage point that she saw the rider. He was coming from the south, moving at a steady pace along a dry wash that cut between 2 low hills. He was alone. His horse was a tall buckskin, and he rode like a man who had been born in the saddle, easy and unhurried, his hat tipped low against the last blaze of the afternoon sun. Rosa opened her mouth to call out, but what came out was barely a croak, thin and useless as paper in the wind. She waved. She did not know if he could see her. She waved again, more violently this time, and stumbled forward on shaking legs. And she must have made enough of a silhouette against the orange sky, because she saw the rider pull up short and then turn his horse in her direction. Phineas Blackwell had been riding for 6 days straight from Tucson, carrying a message for the land office in Prescott that he had already decided he wanted no part of delivering. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with a quiet face and pale gray eyes that had seen enough of the territory to know when something was wrong. He had been a cattle drover for most of his adult life, and before that a ranch hand, and before that a boy who had run off from a Missouri farm at 17, because the farm had not wanted him any more than he had wanted it. He was not a complicated man, in the sense that he had no ambitions beyond doing honest work and keeping his word. But he was not a simple man either, in the sense that he thought a great deal more than he said, and felt a great deal more than he showed. He was the kind of man who would give you his last dollar and then pretend he had simply found it in his pocket. He was the kind of man who had exactly 4 friends in the world and would have walked into fire for any one of them. He saw the figure on the ridge and spurred his horse without a second thought. By the time he reached the base of the ridge and dismounted, Rosa had half climbed, half slid down the rocky face to meet him. She looked terrible, he thought, and then immediately thought that was an unkind observation about a woman who was clearly in serious trouble. She was tall, with a narrow face and dark eyes that were glassy with heat and exhaustion, but still sharp enough to be sizing him up even as she struggled to stand. He went to his saddlebag without a word and pulled out his canteen. It was his last one. He had two others, but both were empty, casualties of the long, dry ride and a calculation he had made poorly when he left the last water source. He knew this. He shook it gently to confirm how much was left, felt the weight of it, and then he held it out to her. "Here," he said, "drink." Rosa Redmond looked at the canteen in his hand, and then she looked at him, and she did not take it immediately, which surprised him enough that he almost said something else. "You drink first," she said. Her voice was a ruin, barely more than a dry whisper, but it was steady. He stared at her. "I have been out here longer than you," she said, meeting his gaze directly despite the obvious effort it cost her. "But you are still on your feet, which means you have reserves left. Drink first, and then give me what remains. That is the more logical arrangement." Phineas Blackwell was quiet for a moment. He had encountered many people in difficult situations in the desert, and not one of them had ever responded to an offer of water by telling him to drink first. Not one of them had tried to reason it out like a woman working a mathematics problem in a schoolhouse. "I appreciate the mathematics," he said at last, his voice dry in its own right, "but I am going to ask you to trust my judgment here and drink the canteen." "Your judgment," she said, and something flickered behind those dark eyes. "That is a thing I do not give out freely to strangers." "No," he agreed, "but I suspect your body is going to overrule your philosophy in about another minute if you do not take this water." Rosa looked at the canteen again. She looked at him. And then she took the canteen with hands that shook slightly, which she clearly hated, and she drank. She drank carefully, which impressed him, because a person in her state was fighting every instinct to drain it all at once. She took 3 long swallows and then stopped herself and held it back out to him. "Your turn," she said. He took it. He drank what little was left, maybe 4 swallows, and capped it. In the fading orange light of the Arizona evening, with the smell of hot rock and desert sage all around them, Phineas Blackwell looked at this difficult, stubborn, inexplicable woman who had just offered him her water in the middle of a desert, and he felt something move in his chest that he could not immediately name. He would spend a great deal of the next several weeks trying to name it. "Phineas Blackwell," he said, extending his hand with the formality that felt right given the circumstances. "I drive cattle and occasionally carry messages for people with more money than sense." She shook his hand, and her grip was firm despite the trembling. "Rosa Redmond. I am not certain what I do at the moment, but previously I was a schoolteacher in Abilene. You are a long way from Abilene, Miss Redmond." "That," she said, with a ghost of something that might have been a smile, "was entirely the point." He helped her onto his horse, because there was no other sensible option, and then climbed up behind her and turned the buckskin south toward a water source he knew was roughly 4 miles off, a spring tucked into a canyon that most people did not know about unless they had ridden this country long enough to learn its secrets. Rosa sat upright in front of him and did not lean back, which he respected, and did not speak, which he also respected, because a person still pulling themselves back from the edge of heat sickness needed quiet more than conversation. The spring was where he remembered it, dark and cold and perfect in the rocky shadow of the canyon wall. He helped her dismount, and she went immediately to her knees at the edge of it and drank from her cupped hands with a careful deliberateness that told him she had some medical knowledge, or at least the wisdom to know that drinking too fast after severe dehydration would only make things worse. He watered his horse and filled all 3 canteens while she splashed water on her face and neck and sat back on her heels and let out a long, slow breath. "Thank you," she said. It sounded like something she meant carefully. "Welcome," he said, equally careful. He made camp there at the spring because the light was gone and the desert was no place to ride in darkness when you did not absolutely have to. He built a small fire, which was enough to keep the chill off because the desert nights in May could still drop sharply, and he opened his saddlebag and produced a packet of hardtack and a small portion of dried beef, and a handful of dried apricots that he set between them without ceremony. "Eat slowly," he said. "You are a man of many instructions," Rosa observed, but she ate slowly, which told him she already knew too. The fire snapped and the canyon walls held the dark close around them, and slowly, as the food and water worked their way back into her, Rosa began to look less like a ghost and more like herself. Color returned to her face. Her hands steadied. Her eyes, which had been glassy and vague when he found her, became sharp and clear and interested in a way that Phineas found distinctly unsettling in the pleasant sense. She told him what had happened: the map, the dried-up well, the horse. She told it without self-pity and without drama, just facts arranged in order, which was both efficient and a little heartbreaking, because the facts themselves were frightening enough without embellishment. "Why were you crossing the territory alone?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "Because I needed to be somewhere that was not Abilene," she said finally, "and because going with someone else would have required telling someone else why, which was not a conversation I was willing to have." He nodded. He understood this more than she might have expected. "Where are you headed?" "Prescott," she said. "There is a school there that is looking for a teacher. I wrote to them 2 months ago and they wrote back and said yes, and I decided that was enough of a plan." He almost laughed, and the sound that came out instead was a low, surprised thing. "I'm also going to Prescott." She looked at him across the fire, and something shifted in her expression, not quite suspicion, not quite relief. "Are you?" "Message to deliver at the land office." "A coincidence," she said. "Or just the territory being small," he replied. She considered this. "I suppose you will tell me we should ride together." "I was not going to tell you anything," Phineas said. "You seem like a person who arrives at her own conclusions." The ghost of a smile again. This time it held a little longer. "I do," she admitted. "And my conclusion is that it would be foolish not to ride with you, given the circumstances. However, I want it understood that I am not your responsibility, and I will be making my own decisions about direction and pace and anything else that involves my own welfare." "Understood," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we are agreed." They slept with the fire between them, Rosa wrapped in the extra blanket he had in his saddlebag, and Phineas with his hat over his face and his saddle for a pillow, and the stars overhead were enormous and indifferent, the way desert stars always are. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathe. In the morning she was already awake when he opened his eyes, sitting near the cold ashes of the fire with her knees pulled up, writing something in a small notebook she had produced from her coat pocket. She did not look up immediately, and he watched her for a moment without meaning to, the way the early light caught the side of her face, and the way her pen moved across the page with a certainty that was very much like the way she spoke. "What are you writing?" he asked. "A letter I have been meaning to finish," she said. She did not offer more than that, and he did not ask. They packed up camp with a minimum of conversation and set off north, taking turns on the buckskin because Rosa was insistent about this despite Phineas's protests that he was perfectly capable of walking. "Your horse is carrying too much weight already," she said, "and you are a bigger person than I am. It is logical that I should walk more." "It is not logical," he said. "It is contrary." "Those are not mutually exclusive," she said, and walked. And Phineas rode the buckskin alongside her at a pace she could match and tried very hard not to find the whole situation more charming than it was. The first day of riding together passed in a rhythm of alternating silence and conversation that felt more natural than Phineas expected. He had spent enough years around cowhands and drovers to have grown accustomed to a particular kind of talk, stories and complaints and arguments about horses and cattle and the price of beef. And it was not that he had never had conversations of any depth, but he had not often had them with someone who argued back with such clean precision. Rosa asked him questions about the territory, about the water sources and the distances, and the names of the mountain ranges that rose in the north. She was building a mental map, he realized, correcting for whatever damage the fraudulent paper one had done. She remembered everything he told her, and she asked follow-up questions that indicated she had actually processed the information rather than simply received it, which was a thing he found unexpectedly beautiful. He told her about the cattle drives, about the years spent moving vast herds across Kansas and Texas and into the territory, the dust and the heat and the occasional catastrophic storm, the peculiar brotherhood of a drive crew. The way a man's character became apparent very quickly when he was tired and scared, and had no audience worth impressing. He told her about the night the Salado River had flooded and they had lost 30 head and 2 men nearly drowned, and the way the foreman, old Cy Perkins, had not slept for 2 days afterward because he felt responsible for every animal and every man and could not let himself rest until he was certain the remainder were safe. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Rosa said. "He was," Phineas said, and left it at that. She did not press, which he appreciated. She seemed to understand, without being told, which pieces of the past were tender. In exchange, she told him about Abilene, about the school where she had taught for 3 years, about the children who came in with muddy boots and reluctant arithmetic, and the ones who surprised her by turning out to love books with a ferocity that made her chest ache. She told him about the town itself, how it had changed since the cattle trade began to move it from a small farming settlement into something louder and less certain of itself, how the saloons had multiplied, and the church on Maple Street had put up a fence that everyone understood as a kind of statement. She did not tell him about the letter in her pocket, or about the man it was addressed to. Not yet. But he was aware of it in the way you are sometimes aware of a thing that has not been said, a shape in the conversation that is defined by what surrounds it. On the second night, they camped near the ruins of an old adobe structure, some homesteaders' attempt at permanence that the desert had slowly reclaimed. Phineas cooked a simple meal of beans and salt pork over the fire, and Rosa dug out the last of a small supply of coffee she had been carrying in her saddlebag, rescued from the horse before Pepper went down, and the smell of it was so welcome and ordinary that it made the whole strange situation feel almost manageable. "Can I ask you something personal?" Rosa said as they ate. "You can ask," he said. "Why are you delivering a message for people you have already decided you want no part of?" He looked at her across the fire. "What makes you think that? You said it yourself the first evening. You said you were carrying a message for the land office that you had already decided you wanted no part of delivering. I have been wondering about it since." He had in fact said that, and he had not expected her to hold it the way she had, turning it over, keeping it. He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork over in his hand. "It is a complicated situation," he said. "Most situations are," she said, "and most people use that as a reason to say nothing." "You do not have to, but I am curious." He looked at the fire. "The message is from a land company," he said. "They want the land office in Prescott to process a series of claims on land that the Apache bands have been using. It is legal, technically. The treaties have been rewritten enough times that most of what was promised has been erased one way or another, and the land company has found the seams." He paused. "I took the job because I needed the money. I am not proud of that." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "The Apache communities in this territory have already lost a great deal," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "they have. I know enough history to know that, and enough of the territory to know the specific land they are talking about. There is a band that has been using the eastern water sources on that land for as long as anyone alive can remember." He set down his fork. "I have been thinking, the whole ride, about what I am going to do when I get there." "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking I might deliver the message and lose it," he said, "somewhere between my hand and the desk." Rosa looked at him for a long moment. "That is a thing that could cost you the payment." "Yes," he said, "and possibly more." "Possibly," he agreed. She nodded slowly. "For what it is worth," she said, "I think the calculus of what is right here is not particularly complicated, even if the situation is." "No," he agreed, "it is not complicated, it is just costly." "Most right things are," she said simply. He watched her face across the fire, the way she said it without drama, as though it were simply a fact of the world she had long since accepted. He thought about what it would be like to know a person who thought this way, who looked at hard things directly without flinching. He thought it would be a particular kind of company. He thought he would like it very much. The third day brought a change in the landscape as they moved out of the low desert and into higher country, where pinyon and juniper began to appear among the rocks, and the air had a faint coolness that was like a gift. Rosa walked beside the horse again for a stretch of the morning, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about the nature of maps and whether the people who made them bore a moral responsibility for the people who used them, she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was not what he had expected. It was not a polite laugh or a careful laugh. It was a sudden, bright, entirely unguarded thing that came out of her when he made a dry observation about the man who had drawn her original map, suggesting that perhaps the fellow had been working entirely from imagination and a desire to seem knowledgeable, and it lit up her whole face in a way that made him briefly lose track of what he had been saying. "I am sorry," she said, catching herself. "Do not be," he said. "It sounds nice." She looked at him sidelong, and there was something in her expression, surprised and a little vulnerable, and then she looked away. They reached the small settlement of Cottonwood Creek that afternoon, which was not so much a town as a collection of determination, a trading post, a small livery, a combination saloon and boarding house, and a corral. Phineas arranged for a room for Rosa at the boarding house, a modest and largely clean establishment run by a formidable woman named Mrs. Herrick, who looked Rosa over with the particular assessment of a woman who has seen all varieties of traveler and has opinions about most of them. "On your own, are you?" Mrs. Herrick said, not unkindly. "For the moment," Rosa said, which Phineas thought was a diplomatically accurate answer. He slept in the livery with his horse, which was not a hardship, and was in fact preferable to most of the alternatives he had slept in over the years. In the morning he found Rosa already in the small common room of the boarding house, sitting at the table with her notebook open and a cup of coffee, which she had apparently persuaded Mrs. Herrick to produce before the official breakfast hour. She had also, he noticed, written something on a fresh piece of paper that was folded and set aside, separate from the notebook. She tucked it away when she saw him come in, not quickly enough to be hiding it, but with the definite air of a person returning a private thing to its proper place. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said, and sat down across from her and accepted the coffee Mrs. Herrick brought him with the quiet resignation of a woman who had decided he was acceptable and would feed him accordingly. Over breakfast, Rosa asked him to tell her more about Prescott, what the town was like, whether it was genuinely the kind of place that would support a school, whether the people she would be working with were likely to be reasonable or difficult. Phineas had been through Prescott twice before, and knew enough to give her a fair picture, which he did, including the parts that were less encouraging, the rough edges of any frontier town, the supply shortages and the political disagreements and the social hierarchies that every community develops whether it intends to or not. She listened carefully and asked smart questions and made notes in her notebook, which he had come to understand was simply how her mind worked, organizing the world on paper so she could act on it more clearly. He did not find this strange. He found it admirable in the way that any competence is admirable when you watch someone exercise it. "You are not going to try to talk me out of it," she observed after a while. "Out of what?" "The move, the school, going alone." She looked at him steadily. "Most people, when I describe my situation, feel compelled to advise me against it." "I do not see anything in your situation that advises against it," Phineas said honestly. "You are clearly capable of managing difficult circumstances. You have a position waiting, and you know what you want. I do not see what role advice against it would serve, other than making the person giving it feel helpful." Rosa put down her coffee cup. She looked at him with the same expression she had had near the spring the second evening, that particular quality of surprised attention, like a person turning a corner and finding a view they had not expected. "You are an unusual man, Phineas Blackwell," she said. "I have been called worse," he said. They left Cottonwood Creek after breakfast, and the road north was better than anything they had traveled so far. An actual established route with wagon ruts wide enough that Phineas sometimes let the buckskin follow them without much guidance, which freed his attention, and he found his attention going with some regularity to Rosa. She had borrowed a spare horse from the livery at Cottonwood Creek, a stolid gray gelding with no ambition and reliable feet, paying for it with money from a purse she kept inside her coat, which she handled with the careful attention of someone who has counted every dollar and knows exactly how many remain. She rode well, not with the easy born-into-the-saddle quality that Phineas had, but with the competent uprightness of a person who had learned and kept practicing, and she held the gray to a steady pace without effort. Riding beside her was easy in a way that riding beside most people was not. He had spent enough time in his own company to know the difference between silence that was comfortable and silence that was merely absence of sound, and the silence between himself and Rosa had, somewhere in the last couple of days, become the comfortable variety. He was not sure when that had happened exactly. He suspected it might have been when she laughed. On the fourth day of riding together, something happened that changed the tenor of things considerably. They had stopped at midday near a creek crossing to rest the horses and eat, and while the animals drank and Rosa sat on a flat rock eating hardtack and apricots and writing in her notebook, Phineas walked a short distance upstream to fill the canteens. He was on his way back when he heard voices, 2 men, and then a third, coming from the direction of the road. He came back around the bend of the creek to find 3 riders who had stopped on the road and appeared to be in conversation with Rosa. He could see, even at a distance from the set of her shoulders, that the conversation was not welcome. He covered the ground between them at a pace that looked casual and was not. The 3 men were rough-looking in the specific way of men who have decided that the frontier is a place where certain rules do not apply to them. The largest of them, a heavy-set man with a beard going gray at the edges and a red kerchief around his neck, was the one doing most of the talking. He was saying something about the road being a long way for a woman to be alone, which was technically true and entirely threatening in the way he was saying it. Rosa was answering him calmly and directly, the way she answered everything, but Phineas could see her right hand had moved to her coat, where he suspected the small pistol he had noticed 2 days ago, a pepper box that had seen better days but was certainly functional, was sitting in her pocket. He walked up without rushing and stood beside the gray gelding. "Ready to go," he said to Rosa, as though the 3 men were simply trees. "Very nearly," she said, with the same calm. The man with the red kerchief looked at Phineas with the measuring look of someone deciding what the situation cost. Phineas met his eyes with the flat, patient look of a man who is not afraid and also not looking for trouble, which is a particular and useful expression in these situations, because it gives the other party very little to work with. "This your wife?" the man said. "My traveling companion," Phineas said, which was accurate and also sent a specific message about the situation. There was a moment, weighted and still, in which the decision was made, and then the man with the red kerchief decided that, whatever the road might hold, this particular situation was not worth the effort, and he wheeled his horse and rode off with his companions following. Rosa released a slow breath. Then she looked at Phineas with an expression he could not quite read. "I was handling it," she said. "I know," he said. "I have seen your pistol," she blinked. "You have." "The first day," he said. "The pocket of your coat, I noticed." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Did you think about it, what it means that I am carrying it?" "I thought it meant you were a sensible person in uncertain territory," he said. The expression she gave him then was different from any he had seen from her before. It was quieter somehow, more open. "I am not going to pretend that was not useful what you just did," she said, nodding toward the road where the men had gone. "I know," he said again. "But you would have managed. I believe I would have, she agreed, but having someone beside you is still different from not having someone. It usually is, he said. They mounted and rode, and the afternoon went long and gold around them, and somewhere in the warmth of it Rosa said, mostly to the road ahead, "The letter in my pocket is addressed to a man I was expected to marry." He waited. "His name is Calvin Garlow," she said. "He owns a good portion of land outside Abilene, and he is not a cruel man, but he is a certain kind of man, the kind who has very fixed ideas about what a woman should occupy herself with, and a schoolteacher was not among the occupations he considered suitable for his wife." She paused. "He asked me to give it up when we married. He was very reasonable about it. He explained that his house was large enough to keep me busy, and that we would likely have children soon enough, and that he saw no reason for me to trouble myself with other people's children when I had plenty to look forward to at home." Phineas listened. "I had been teaching for 3 years at that point," she said. "I cannot explain to you, without sounding sentimental, what those 3 years meant. The children who came in not knowing how to read and left knowing. The girls especially, because I know what it means to have tools, to have knowledge, to be able to manage your own correspondence and your own accounting and your own thinking, without depending on someone else to do it for you." She looked at the road. "I wrote him a letter saying I would not marry him. And then I did not send it because I did not know what would come next. And then I got the letter from Prescott and I packed my things and I came. And the letter is still unsent," Phineas said. "Yes," she said. "I keep thinking I should have left it. It felt important to carry it so that I would remember the reason, but I think I might actually post it from Prescott if there is a mail service." "There is," he said. "Good," she said. Then quietly, "He will be angry." "Yes," Phineas said, "likely. But he will find someone else," she said. "Someone more suited to the life he wants. I do not think he will grieve for very long." "No," Phineas said. "I do not think a man like that would." There was something in the way he said it, quiet and without judgment, but with a precision that caught the light of what she had left unsaid, and Rosa turned to look at him fully for the first time since she had started speaking. He was looking at the road, as he usually did when he was being careful. "And what about you?" she said. "Is there anyone who will be angry that you have ridden off across the territory with someone else's message?" He almost smiled. "No one who would put themselves out about it," he said. "No family, not to speak of," he said. "A sister in Missouri. She writes twice a year and I write back, and that is the shape of it. She has her own life, her husband and her children, and she does not worry about me as much as she used to." "And no one else," Rosa said. It was not quite a question. "No one else," he confirmed. The gold of the afternoon deepened toward evening, and the junipers threw long shadows across the road, and there was something between them now that had not been there in the morning, some new transparency that made the air feel different. Phineas was aware of it in the way you are aware of a change in weather before it fully arrives, a shift in pressure, a particular quality of light. They camped that night on a flat shelf of ground above the road, sheltered on one side by a rock face and open to the east, where they could see the stars coming on one by one in the darkening sky. Phineas built the fire and Rosa arranged the bedrolls, and they ate the last of the food from Cottonwood Creek and discussed, practically, what they would need to acquire at the next settlement. But after the meal, when the fire had settled into a bed of embers and the night was very quiet around them, Rosa said something that he had not expected. "Do you believe in the kind of love that people write songs about?" she asked. He looked at the embers. "I believe it exists," he said carefully. "I think I have seen it a few times in people who managed to find each other and then had the sense to hold on. I'm not sure how common it is." "I was taught," Rosa said, "that the sensible kind of marriage is a partnership of mutual benefit and reasonable compatibility. That love in the romantic sense is something that either comes after or does not come at all, and either way the arrangement is sound." "And do you believe that?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I did," she said. "I am less certain now." He looked at her then. She was watching the embers, her arms around her knees, and she had that quality she sometimes had in the firelight of being very still and very alive at the same time. "What changed?" he asked. She turned to look at him. In the dark, her eyes were very direct, which was her natural state but felt more weighted here in the quiet. "I am not entirely sure yet," she said. "I think I am still finding out." He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying better. But he looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a long-held moment that neither of them broke, until an owl cried somewhere in the junipers and Rosa looked away first and said, in a voice that was almost entirely steady, that they should probably sleep. He agreed. He lay down with his hat over his face, the same as always, and he did not sleep for a long time. The following day they reached a proper town, a settlement large enough to have a general store, a post office, a hotel, a doctor's office, and a church, and Phineas bought supplies while Rosa went to the post office. He did not ask about the letter. She did not tell him. But when she came out, her coat pocket was flatter, and she walked with the particular lightness of someone who has set down a weight they have been carrying for a long time. "All right?" he asked. "All right," she said, and she said it with a clarity and completeness that made him understand the thing was settled. They stayed the night at the hotel, in separate rooms, and in the morning a man at the front desk mentioned that the road north to Prescott had been reported as passable, but that there had been some trouble 2 days back, a dispute over water rights that had sent a couple of parties back rather than forward. Phineas asked questions until he understood the nature of the trouble, and then he told Rosa what he had learned. "The land company," he said. "Their people are already moving in the area, putting up markers. There have been confrontations." Rosa absorbed this. "This is connected to your message," she said. "Almost certainly," he said. He stood in the quiet of the hotel lobby and looked at the message in his saddlebag, in his mind's eye, the sealed letter with its fine paper and its officious instructions. He had thought about what to do with it for the entire journey. Standing here, with Rosa watching him with her steady eyes and the knowledge of everything she had said by the fire about the calculus of what is right, he found that he had already decided and had simply been waiting to acknowledge it. "I am going to deliver it," he said. She waited. "And then I am going to tell the man at the land office exactly what I know about the water sources on that land, and who has been using them, and how long. And I am going to suggest in very plain terms that if the office processes those claims without investigation, they will be doing so with full knowledge of the human cost, and that I intend to speak to the territorial newspaper about it regardless." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "That will likely cost you the payment," she said, which was what she had said before, but differently now. "Yes," he said, "and possibly more," she said again. "Yes," she nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "then let us go to Prescott." The last 2 days of the journey north were the most beautiful of the whole trip. The land had changed into something greener and more varied, ponderosa pine beginning to appear above the juniper line, and the air had a freshness to it that felt like a promise after the brutal honesty of the low desert. Rosa rode with her face up, taking it in, and Phineas watched her more than the road and did not care particularly that he was doing so. They talked almost constantly now. It was a thing that had crept up on them, this ease of conversation, the way it had moved from careful and polite to direct, and then to something that felt more intimate, not in the way of secrets necessarily, but in the way of genuine interest. He wanted to know what she thought about things. He wanted to hear her argue with an idea until she had made it give up its flaws. He wanted to hear her laugh again, and he was rewarded for this one on the afternoon of the 6th day when he described in detail an incident from a cattle drive involving a steer, a thunderstorm, and a very unfortunate tuba belonging to a traveling musician, and her laugh came out of her like something she could not have kept in if she had tried. "That cannot be a true story," she said, wiping her eyes. "I have witnesses," he said. "Most of them still refuse to talk about it." She laughed again, and the sound went out into the pines and came back differently, layered and light, and Phineas Blackwell felt something in his chest that he had been feeling in various intensities for the better part of a week now, and he recognized it, finally, for what it was. It was not a complicated thing. It was, in fact, the simplest thing, just the clarity of wanting to be near someone, the particular gravity of a person who has become, without announcement, the most interesting part of your landscape. It was the fact that he had started thinking about what the conversation would be tomorrow and the day after and further on than that, in ways that had nothing to do with the road or the destination. He said nothing. He was not the kind of man who said things before he understood them, and this, while he understood the feeling, he did not yet understand the situation around it. He did not know if she felt any corresponding pull, though he thought about the fire-like conversations and the way she had looked at him on certain occasions, and allowed himself, quietly, to wonder. They rode into Prescott on a Thursday morning, 6 days after Phineas had found Rosa on the ridge, and the town was larger and livelier than anything they had passed through on the journey, a proper territorial town with a substantial main street and a courthouse, and the noise of commerce and politics and daily life going on in all directions. After the silence of the desert and the long empty road, it felt almost overwhelming, and Rosa sat straight in her saddle and looked at it all with the focused attention of a person taking inventory. "There," she said, pointing to a sign that read Prescott School Board, visible above a door on the far side of the main street. "Land office is 2 blocks north," Phineas said. They looked at each other. "I will meet you at the hotel," she said. "Whichever one seems reasonable, I will ask at the school board." "All right," he said. And then neither of them moved for a moment because both of them were aware that the thing that had organized the last 6 days, the direction, the purpose, the shared road, was about to divide, and after that neither of them quite knew what the shape of things would be. "Good luck," she said at last. "At the land office." "Same to you," he said. "At the school board." She nodded, and she turned the gray gelding toward the far side of the street, and he watched her go further than was necessary for someone who simply needed to know the direction before heading to the land office himself. The land office meeting did not go well, in the sense that the man behind the desk, a Mr. Fenn, received Phineas's message with the expression of a person who had been waiting for it and did not appreciate anything that accompanied it. Phineas delivered the message and then delivered everything he had promised himself he would say, carefully and completely, and Mr. Fenn grew redder and more agitated with each sentence. "You were paid to carry that message, Mr. Fenn said, not to editorialize." "The editorializing," Phineas said, "is at no additional charge." He was told, in increasingly heated terms, that his payment was forfeited, and that he should not expect further employment from the land company or any of its associates. He received this information without great distress, because he had expected it, and then he said one final thing, which was that he had already spoken briefly to a man outside who had introduced himself as a correspondent for the Arizona Weekly Miner, which was true, and that the conversation had been informative for both parties, which was also true. He left the land office. He stood on the wooden sidewalk in the Prescott sun, with no payment and a clean conscience, and after a moment he went to find Rosa. He found her outside the school board office, sitting on a bench with the look of someone who has just received news and has not yet fully processed it. "Well," he said, sitting beside her. "I have the position," she said. "The school opens in September. They have a building already and 14 students enrolled, and they are very pleased I have come." She paused. "The salary is modest, but the work is right," he said. "The work is exactly right," she said. Then she looked at him. "And you," he told her. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and at the end she said, "The newspaper correspondent, is that likely to make any real difference?" "I do not know," he said honestly. "Maybe not immediately, but the territory is changing and there are people who care about these things, and a public record matters even when it does not feel like it is enough." He looked at his hands. "I could not carry it and do nothing." "No," she said quietly. "You could not." She looked at him, and her expression had that quality again, the open one, the one that made him feel seen in a way he was not accustomed to and had not expected to want as much as he apparently did. "What will you do now?" "About work. There is a ranch outside of town," he said. "Harker's. I know the foreman from a drive years ago. I thought I might go out and see if they need a hand." "And will they?" "Probably," he said. "It is always the wrong time of year to not need an extra hand on a cattle ranch." She nodded. She was looking at the street, at the traffic of horses and wagons and the ordinary business of a frontier town going about its day. And then she said, without preamble, which was her way, "I would like it if you did not disappear entirely, Phineas." He looked at her. "I am not asking for anything specific," she said, her voice even but her eyes not quite meeting his, which was unusual for her. "I am only saying that the last 6 days have been the most interesting days I have had in some time, and that I have found your company to be very good company, and that Prescott is a large enough town to not accidentally run into someone you want to see, and so an intention must be stated if the running into is to happen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Rosa." She looked at him. "I intend," he said carefully, "to run into you as often as you will permit." The color that moved into her face was not entirely from the sun, and he found it spectacularly beautiful. "Good," she said, and stood up and brushed the dust from her skirt and said they should find the hotel. The weeks that followed had a quality that Phineas struggled to adequately describe to himself, but which he was aware of with every part of him. He rode out to Harker's ranch the day after their arrival and spoke to the foreman, a quiet man named Webb, who shook his hand and told him to start Monday, which Phineas did. The work was familiar and hard, and he was good at it, and there was a satisfaction in that. In the evenings when he sat on the bunkhouse porch and watched the sky go gold and pink over the mountains and thought about everything. He rode into Prescott on Saturdays, and the first Saturday he went to the place where Rosa was boarding, a clean and respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, and knocked on the door and asked if Miss Redmond was available, and Rosa came downstairs with her notebook in her hand and her hair done up, and looked at him with a calm delight that she made no effort to conceal. They walked in the town. They had dinner at the restaurant on the main street. They talked for 3 hours, and it felt like 30 minutes. The following Saturday the same, and then the Saturday after that. And by the 4th Saturday, it was an established fact of both their lives that Phineas Blackwell came into town on Saturday and spent the day with Rosa Redmond. And the people of Prescott who noticed such things had formed their own conclusions, which they were entirely correct about. He brought her a book, one Saturday, that he had found at the general store, a collection of essays by someone whose name he had never heard but whose work the store owner had recommended with genuine enthusiasm. Rosa opened it with the expression of someone receiving something they had wanted without knowing they were going to receive it. "How did you know I would like this?" she asked. "I did not," he said, "but I thought you would argue with it productively." She looked at him over the top of the book. "That is not a compliment." "I meant it as one," he said. She kept looking at him, and then she looked back at the book, and the small smile that she kept for certain moments was there, and he counted it as one of the better moments of his adult life. In September, the school opened. Phineas rode into town early that morning and found Rosa outside the schoolhouse, which was a solid, plain building that she had spent the previous 2 weeks organizing with the focused energy of someone who has wanted exactly this particular thing for a long time. She had arranged the desks and written the alphabet on the chalkboard and sorted the books, and was now standing outside in the early light, looking at the building with an expression he had not seen before, something very close to reverent. He stood beside her without speaking. After a moment she said, "I have been working toward this since I was 17 years old and had a teacher who changed everything." "Tell me," he said. And she did, right there on the street in the September morning, about the teacher, a woman named Miss Elspeth Warren, who had run the school in the small Arkansas town where Rosa had grown up, who had lent her books from her own shelf, and argued with her about ideas as though Rosa's arguments were worth taking seriously. Who had told her, on the last day of school when Rosa was 16, that she had a mind that was too good to leave idle, and that the best thing she could do with it was use it to give other minds the same chance. She died the next spring, Rosa said. Fever. I was not there. I did not find out until a month later. She was quiet for a moment. I have thought about her every time I have stood at the front of a classroom. Phineas looked at her profile, the long line of her jaw and the steadiness of her and the grief that sat in her voice, old and honored. The way grief is when a person has carried it long enough to make peace with it. She would have liked Prescott, he said. Rosa turned to look at him, and her expression was soft in a way that she did not often allow or perhaps could not always control. Yes, she said, she would have. The first students began arriving then, 14 of them between the ages of 6 and 13, the children of ranchers and merchants and tradespeople, noisy and various and wonderful, and Rosa stepped forward to meet them with the particular light that came into her when she was doing the thing she was meant to do. And Phineas stood back and watched, and felt something so large and warm in his chest that it was almost uncomfortable. He rode back to Harker's that afternoon with his mind entirely in Prescott. There was an evening in October when everything shifted again. He had stayed later than usual on a Saturday, and they were walking in the cooling evening on the road at the edge of town, where the Ponderosas started, and the light was the particular copper gold of a mountain autumn, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke from the houses. And Rosa had been telling him about a student, a boy of 9 named Arthur, who had come in unable to read a single word, and had in the last month cracked the code of letters with a visible, transformative joy that Rosa described with such precise and loving attention to detail that Phineas felt he had witnessed it himself. He stopped walking. She noticed after a couple of steps and turned to look at him, questioning. He said, "Rosa, I need to tell you something." She waited. She was very good at waiting, he had noticed. She gave a thing the space it needed without rushing it. "I have been trying," he said, "to say this in a way that is not alarming and not excessive, and that makes the thing clear without putting any pressure on you that you have not asked for." He paused. "I have not found that way, so I am going to say it plainly instead, and ask you to understand that it comes with no expectation beyond honest communication." She was very still, watching him. "I am in love with you," he said. "I think I have been since the desert, or very shortly after it, and I am aware that the timeline is short, and that you have come to Prescott specifically to build a life that is your own, on your own terms. And I do not want to be a thing that complicates that. But I am not able to keep spending every Saturday with you and having conversations that are better than any conversations I have had in my life, and watching you with your students and with the world, and not tell you what that means to me." The copper light was on her face, and the pines moved slightly in the evening air, and she looked at him for a long moment with that full, direct attention that was one of the most distinctive things about her. "Phineas," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember what I said to you by the fire, about not being sure yet about the kind of love that people write songs about?" "Yes," he said. "I have been finding out," she said quietly, "for the last several months. I believe I have my answer." He took one step toward her, and she did not step back, and then he took another, and she was looking up at him with her dark eyes very clear and something in them that answered everything he had said. And he reached up and very carefully tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, which was a small and ordinary gesture that felt to both of them like something enormous. "Is that so?" he said. "It is so," she confirmed, and there was the smile, the real one, the one without any reserve in it. And then he kissed her, gently and deliberately, with the pines above them and the mountain air all around them and the last copper light of the October evening making everything look like a painting. When they broke apart, she put her hand against his chest, her palm flat, feeling his heartbeat, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood there in the road for a moment that belonged entirely to them. "Well," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady for the first time in his memory, and he liked it more than he could say. Well, he agreed. They walked back to town in the gathering dark, closer together than they had walked before, and the world felt newly arranged, like furniture moved in a familiar room to let in more light. The winter in Prescott was cold but not brutal, and it shaped itself around the rhythms Rosa and Phineas had built together. He still came on Saturdays, but now sometimes on Wednesdays as well, and the evenings were spent less in walking and more in the parlor of Mrs. Calloway's, which Mrs. Calloway permitted with the understanding that the parlor door remain open, and that she herself was generally present with her sewing, though she was discreet enough about her sewing to give them the privacy of not listening. They read together. They argued about ideas with a gleeful thoroughness that frequently alarmed Mrs. Calloway's other boarders, but which both Rosa and Phineas found to be one of the primary pleasures of the relationship. Rosa had views about education and literature, and the nature of justice that were sharp and well-reasoned and occasionally radical by the standards of the territory in 1874, and Phineas agreed with more of them than she initially expected, and pushed back on the rest with enough intellectual honesty to make the arguments genuinely useful. He told her, one evening in December, more about his childhood than he had ever told anyone. About the farm in Missouri and the father who had been a cold and difficult man, not cruel exactly but deeply withholding, the kind of man who considered praise a form of weakness and affection, a thing to be rationed. About the mother who had been kind but overwhelmed, with 5 children and a farm and a husband who made warmth expensive. About running off at 17, and the years of figuring out who he was when no one was telling him who to be. Rosa listened to all of it with the quality she had, of hearing not just the words but the shape underneath them. "You turned out all right," she said when he had finished, and the simplicity of it, the directness, the lack of any qualification or performance made it the most comforting thing anyone had ever said to him about any of it. "I think I did," he said. "Eventually." She reached across the space between them and took his hand, and held it, and they sat like that for a while with Mrs. Calloway's fire crackling nearby and the cold pressing against the windows, and it was one of those moments that a person knows is important while it is happening, which is not always the case. Phineas asked for Rosa's hand in January. He did not make a grand event of it. He did not arrange any theater or choose a public moment, because he knew Rosa well enough to know that theater would make her uncomfortable, and a public moment would make her feel she had less than full control of her own response, which she needed to have. He simply, on a Wednesday evening in Mrs. Calloway's parlor, with Mrs. Calloway conveniently absent doing something in the kitchen that she had decided was very pressing, told Rosa that he loved her and that he wanted to marry her, not because he felt she needed his provision or his name or his protection, but because he wanted to build a life with her, and because every version of his future that he could imagine that made any sense had her in it, and he would like to know if she felt the same way. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then she said, "I have some conditions." He knew better than to smile, but he felt the smile happening somewhere. "Of course you do. I intend to keep teaching," she said. "That is not a negotiation, it is a fact." "I know," he said. "I would not have it any other way." "I intend to manage my own finances," she said. "My salary is my own and I will decide how it is used." "Agreed," he said. "I intend to have opinions about everything," she said, with a slightly different quality, the humor beginning to show at the edges. "You already do," he pointed out, "and I love them." She looked at him then, and the humor had softened into something more complete, more serious and warm at the same time. "I want a house," she said, "not rented rooms, a proper house where I can have my books on shelves and have students for tutoring if I want to." "We will build one," he said, "or buy one, whatever makes more sense when we look at the land." She looked at him for another long moment. "Phineas Blackwell," she said. "Yes, Rosa Redmond." "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, which was not fancy but was solid and well-made, a small band of silver that he had ordered from the jeweler on the main street 3 weeks ago in a fit of certainty that had surprised him with its completeness. He had walked in there one morning after a conversation with Rosa and simply known the way certain things present themselves with no ambiguity. She looked at the ring in his palm and then at him, and she picked it up and put it on her own finger, which was the most Rosa Redmond thing she could possibly have done and which made him love her absolutely. "It fits," she said. "I had help," he said. "Mrs. Calloway knew your size." Rosa turned to look at the kitchen doorway, through which Mrs. Calloway was very visibly not listening. "Mrs. Calloway," she called. "Yes, dear," said Mrs. Calloway, who had clearly been waiting. "We are engaged," Rosa said. "I know, dear," said Mrs. Calloway, and came out of the kitchen with a cake she had clearly already prepared for this purpose, and Rosa burst out laughing, the full, bright, unguarded laugh, and Phineas thought that he would spend the rest of his life making sure he heard that laugh as often as possible. They were married in April, a year almost to the day from when Phineas had found Rosa on that ridge in the desert. The ceremony was in the church on the eastern side of Prescott, small and genuine, with Webb from the ranch as Phineas's witness and Mrs. Calloway, and 2 of the school board members as Rosa's. Rosa wore a dress of deep blue that she had made herself from fabric she had chosen with great deliberation at the dry goods store, and she walked down the aisle without anyone giving her away, because she was of the opinion that she was not a thing to be given. And the minister, who had learned very quickly what sort of person Rosa Redmond was, had accommodated this without argument. Phineas stood at the front of that little church and watched her come toward him, and thought that he was the most fortunate man in the territory, and possibly in the broader United States, and the feeling did not diminish with the words or the ring or the moment afterward in the cool April air outside, where Rosa took his face in both her hands and kissed him with a directness that made Webb cough diplomatically, and Mrs. Calloway make a small sound of approval. They had purchased a house 2 months before the wedding, a well-built structure on the eastern side of town with 3 rooms downstairs and 2 up, and a good stone fireplace, and a porch that looked out at the mountains. It had a room that Rosa immediately designated for books, which Phineas filled one wall of with shelves over the course of 2 weekends, while Rosa handed him boards and argued with him about the spacing, and was entirely correct about the spacing. Life arranged itself with a satisfying solidity. Phineas continued at Harker's through the spring and into the summer, and in the evenings he came home to a house that smelled of whatever Rosa had cooking, and the particular organized warmth that was entirely hers. They ate dinner together every evening, and talked over the day with the ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms, and genuinely enjoy the knowledge. Rosa told him about the students, their progresses and difficulties, and the small and large dramas of a frontier schoolroom. He told her about the cattle, the land, the characters of the men he worked with. On weekends they did things together with a comfortable pragmatism, gardening and repairs and occasional rides out into the country around Prescott, where the landscape was beautiful and various, and Rosa was always observing it with that quality of careful attention she brought to everything. She was writing, he discovered, a long essay about the education of girls in frontier territories, drawing on her experience in Abilene and now in Prescott, with specific attention to the ways in which limited access to education shaped the options available to women. She wrote it at the desk in the bookroom on Saturday mornings while he sat nearby reading, and occasionally she would read a passage aloud and he would listen and respond, and the conversation that followed was always one of the ones he counted. She submitted the essay in the autumn to a newspaper in San Francisco that her former teacher, Miss Warren, had once mentioned as a publication of some seriousness, and 6 weeks later received a letter saying they would print it. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down very carefully and said nothing for a moment. Phineas watched her. "They are going to print it," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard you read it." "Many people will read it," she said. "People I do not know." Many people who do not know you, he agreed, will read something true that you have written, and some of them will think about it, and some of those will do something about what they think. He paused. Miss Warren would have been extremely pleased. Rosa looked at him across the table. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears, or perhaps had just enough to do with them to light things up without spilling over. "You know," she said, "for a man who talks very little, you always seem to say exactly the right thing." "I save up," he said. She laughed, and he got up and went around the table and kissed her on top of the head, and she caught his hand and held it against her cheek for a moment, and the October light came through the kitchen window and lay gold on the floor. In the late spring of 1875, Rosa told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the practical, direct way she told him everything while they were both in the kitchen before breakfast, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something so enormous that for a moment he had no words at all, which did not happen to him often. "Well," he said when he found them again. "Well," she agreed, watching him with those dark eyes. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I am entirely well," she said. "I have been to see the doctor, and he confirms things are as they should be. I intend to continue teaching through the autumn. I have spoken to the school board, and they were initially reluctant, but I made my position clear." She paused. "More than once." "Of course you did," he said, and went around the table and took her face in his hands with the most careful gentleness he had ever applied to anything, and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth. And she put her arms around him, and they stood like that in the kitchen with the morning light coming in, and it was one of the moments he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. The baby was born in November, in the house on the eastern side of Prescott, with Mrs. Calloway present as she had insisted on being, and a local midwife named Dora who had steady hands and a calm voice and 20 years of experience. It was a long night, and Phineas spent most of it on the porch despite the cold because he could not be in the room and could not go far from it, pacing and looking at the stars and having a very honest and unrehearsed conversation with whatever portion of the universe was paying attention. Just before dawn the cry came, thin and powerful and absolutely certain of itself, which was, he would later say, the most appropriate thing that had ever happened in his vicinity. The baby was a boy. Rosa, when he came in, was exhausted and luminous in the way of someone who has done an enormous and difficult thing and knows they have done it, and the child was in her arms with his eyes squinched shut against the lamplight, and he was red and small and furious at the indignity of the world. Phineas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, and Mrs. Calloway, who had been composed throughout the entire night, quietly began to cry in the corner, which she did not acknowledge. "What do you think?" Rosa asked, her voice rough and warm in hers. "I think," Phineas said, and his own voice was somewhat unsteady, "that he already looks as though he has strong opinions." "I do not know where he gets that," Rosa said, with the ghost of the smile. "They named him James Warren Blackwell. James for no reason except that they both liked it, Warren for the teacher who had started everything. The years that followed had the quality of things built well, solid and warm and full of the small and large events that make up a real life. James grew from a red and furious newborn into a sturdy, curious, endlessly energetic boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet steadiness, a combination that expressed itself in a child who would sit still for an hour to watch a lizard and then run for an hour because running felt good. Rosa kept teaching. She had negotiated with the school board more than once over the years, and the school had grown, and she had taken on a second teacher in 1877, a young woman fresh from Ohio, and between the two of them they had managed to extend the school year and add more advanced coursework, which Rosa had written the curriculum for, and which the school board had initially resisted and eventually adopted. Phineas left Harker's in 1876 to manage a smaller ranch closer to town, which allowed him to come home every evening and which suited his abilities very well. He had a natural authority with the men who worked under him and an instinct for cattle and land that made the work go well, and the ranch prospered steadily if not spectacularly, which was the right kind of prospering. He got a letter from his sister in Missouri in 1877, which said that things were difficult back home, that her husband had fallen ill and the farm was struggling. Rosa, reading the letter after Phineas, set it down and looked at him. "We should bring her here," she said, without any preamble. He looked at her. "She is your family," Rosa said simply. "And if the farm is struggling, the right thing is to offer her a real alternative. There is room in this house for more people, and Prescott is a growing town, and her husband, if he can work at all, may do better in a different climate." He wrote to his sister that evening, the longest letter he had written in years, and she wrote back 2 months later to say that yes, she thought she would come, and Phineas drove a wagon all the way to meet her party at the depot in Phoenix in the spring of 1878 and brought them back to Prescott. His sister Clara and her husband Thomas and their 2 daughters, who were 8 and 10, and immediately fell into a complicated and delightful alliance with James. Clara, seeing the house and the life, and Rosa specifically, said very little for the first 2 days, which Phineas understood as processing. On the 3rd evening she found him alone on the porch and said, "She is remarkable, your wife." "Yes," he agreed. "And you are happy," Clara said, which was not quite a question. "Yes," he said again with no qualification. Clara looked at him for a moment. "You were such a difficult boy," she said, "stubborn and silent and determined to be unhappy." "I was," he agreed. "And look at you now," she said softly, and she put her hand on his arm the way she had when they were children and he was still figuring out the world. Thomas's lungs responded well to the drier mountain air, as Rosa had thought they might, and by summer he was well enough to take on light work, and by the following year he was working full-time and they had found a small house of their own nearby, and the extended family that Prescott had become was a thing that both surprised and deeply suited Phineas, who had not known, until he had it, how much he had wanted it. Rosa's essay, the one about frontier education, had by this time been reprinted in 3 other newspapers and had led to a correspondence with several other educators across the territories that Rosa maintained with the dedicated attention she gave to everything she cared about. She had written 2 more essays since, and had been asked by a woman's educational society in Chicago to contribute to a collection they were publishing. She had done so with the same calm certainty with which she did everything. In 1879 they had a daughter, born in May when the ponderosas were putting out new bright green tips and the air smelled like the best version of itself. They named her Elspeth. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's way of looking at things with the patience of someone who intends to understand exactly what they are looking at. James, who was 4, received his sister with the thorough and practical affection of a child who has been well loved, and therefore has love to give, and within a week had appointed himself her primary protector, which he maintained with a touching seriousness that made Rosa laugh and Phineas quietly love his son more than he would have thought possible. The Prescott School continued to grow and to be the central fact of Rosa's professional life, though by now it had become more than that. It had become a kind of legacy, a thing that was shaping the community in ways that were visible if you knew what to look for, in the young women who went on to take up professions that would not have been available to them without the education, in the children who became readers and thinkers and curious people, because a woman with strong opinions and steady hands had decided that was what they deserved to be. One Saturday in the autumn of 1880, when the aspens had gone gold and the air had the sharp clarity that Phineas had come to love more than almost any other thing about this country, he and Rosa walked out along the road east of town, the same road where they had walked the evening he told her he loved her. The children were with Clara, which was a regular arrangement that suited everyone. They walked the way they always walked, in a comfortable shoulder-to-shoulder rhythm, not always talking, not needing to. The aspens shook around them in a light wind and the leaves came down in a slow gold rain, and Rosa slipped her hand through his arm and they walked like that, And Phineas thought about the ridge in the desert 7 years ago, the thin croak of her voice and the way she had held out the canteen and said drink first, and the way everything in him had recognized her without his brain having caught up yet. "What are you thinking?" Rosa asked. "The desert," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I think about it sometimes," she said, "about how close it was. Another few hours and the outcome would have been entirely different." "It would have been," he agreed. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "what the odds were, of you being on that road at that time going to the same destination, of the map being wrong and Pepper going down and me being on that particular ridge at that particular moment? I try not to think about it too closely," he said. "It makes me feel things that are too large to be comfortable." "Gratitude," she said. "Something larger than gratitude," he said. "Something that does not have an ordinary word." She pressed his arm slightly. "Do you remember," she said, "what I said to you when you offered me the canteen?" "Every word," he said. "I was so frightened," she said, with a small surprised quality as though she was still slightly amazed by herself. "I was genuinely frightened, and I still could not simply take the water without arguing about who should drink first." "No," he said fondly, "you could not." "You laughed," she said, "not out loud, but I could see it." "I was charmed," he admitted, "completely and immediately, though I did not understand what that meant until considerably later." "When did you understand it?" she asked. He thought about it. "When you laughed," he said. "The first time I heard you laugh on the road about the map and the man who drew it, something became clear then, like clouds breaking." She turned to look at him as they walked, and the gold light was on her face, and she was 41 years old now and more herself than she had been when he found her, if that was possible, more certain of her own substance and the direction of her life. And she was the most beautiful person he had ever been in the same room with, or the same landscape. "I think," she said carefully, "that the argument about the water was the first time I had ever spoken to a man who actually heard what I said as opposed to waiting for me to finish speaking." "I heard you," he said simply. "Every word." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she turned back to the road ahead, but she leaned slightly against him as they walked. A small and entirely voluntary motion that she would have argued was simply the effect of the uneven ground, and Phineas did not argue because he was holding her arm and felt no need to. "I would like to go back someday," Rosa said. "To that country, not the part where everything went wrong, but the spring, where you took me the first night." "The canyon," he said. "Yes. I have thought about it often. It was beautiful in its own very austere way." "We will go," he said, "next spring. The children are old enough for a trip like that if we plan it properly." "James will be beside himself with excitement," she said. "Elspeth will observe everything carefully and then ask questions that take us 30 minutes to answer," he said. Rosa laughed, and it went out into the aspens and came back scattered and warm, and Phineas held the sound of it in the same part of himself where he held all the things that mattered most. They walked further into the gold afternoon, and the mountains stood blue and enormous in the north, and the territory around them held its particular ancient quiet, and Rosa Redmond Blackwell and Phineas Blackwell walked through it together with the ease and rightness of two people who have found in each other exactly what they did not know they were looking for. The following spring they did go back. All four of them, Phineas and Rosa and James, who was 5 and spent the entire journey in a state of barely contained wonder, and Elspeth, who was 1 and was carried by turns and regarded the desert with the same measuring attention she gave to everything. They rode through the low country and into the canyon where the spring still lived in its cool rocky shadow, as dark and clear and cold as Phineas remembered, and Rosa stood at the edge of it and put her hand in the water and looked up at him with an expression that needed no words at all. James drank from the spring and pronounced it the best water he had ever tasted, which delighted his mother enormously. Elspeth, being held near the water's edge, reached her small hand out toward the surface with the absolute certainty of a person who intends to touch a thing, and Rosa let her fingers brush the water, and the cold of it made her draw back with a small sound of surprise, and then reach out again with more determination, which made Phineas say, quietly and privately to Rosa, that he recognized that expression. "She gets it from her father," Rosa said serenely. "Reach your hand in the water, touch the cold, reach again," he said. "That is the specific definition of your personality." Rosa looked at him with those dark eyes that were still, after all the years and all the conversations and all the mornings and evenings and ordinary days, the most interesting eyes he had ever looked into. "I offered you the water first," she reminded him. "You did," he said, "and I fell in love with you for it." "Just for that?" she asked, with the ghost of the smile that had become over the years less of a ghost and more of a complete and confident thing. "That was the beginning," he said. "Everything else was confirmation." She reached up and touched his face with her palm, the same gesture she had made on their wedding day, the same weight and warmth of it, a gesture that had become one of the private languages of their life together. "Phineas," she said. "Yes, Rosa," he said. "I am very glad you were on that road," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." James was already exploring along the canyon wall, with the industrious focus of a 5-year-old, who has decided that the next outcropping of rock probably contains something remarkable. Rosa watched him and then looked back at Phineas, and then at the spring and the canyon and the desert sky above, enormous and blue and indifferent in the way that the sky over the territory always is, as though it has seen too much to get sentimental. But they were sentimental, both of them, in the private way of people who are strong enough to feel things fully without being undone by them. They stood together at the spring in the canyon in the Arizona morning, and they were settled and warm and known to each other in the complete way that takes years and requires both courage and consistency. And the world that had brought them to this place, the wrong map and the dead well and the horse that gave out and the ridge silhouetted against the orange desert sky, all of it had been exactly what it needed to be. Rosa took his hand, and they watched their children in the cool shadow of the canyon, and the spring went on turning over its dark, cold water into the desert morning, the same as it always had, the same as it would long after all of this was memory, and Phineas Blackwell held his wife's hand and knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who has been honest with himself for long enough, that this was the life he had been riding toward without knowing it, through all the dusty miles and silent years, and that it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough. In the evenings back in Prescott, when the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, they sat on the porch in 2 chairs they had placed there specifically for this purpose, and looked at the mountains against the dark sky, and sometimes talked and sometimes did not. The silence between them was still the comfortable kind, still the kind that does not need filling. Rosa had her notebook sometimes, scratching out ideas for whatever she was writing. Phineas had a book, more often than not, a habit Rosa had quietly cultivated in him over the years by leaving interesting ones in visible places. The mountains did not change. The stars did not change. The town around them grew and changed with the steady pace of a territory becoming something more permanent. New buildings and new families, and the railroad rumors that had been circulating for years and would eventually prove true. History moved through the territory in its complicated way, and Rosa wrote about it and Phineas watched it, and they both understood, without excessive sentimentality, that they were living inside something that would not last exactly this way forever. But what they had between them, the specific weight and warmth and reality of it, the good argument and the shared silence and the children's voices from inside the house and the particular way she said his name when she meant something important, that was not a historical thing. That was just a true thing. The truest thing, maybe, that either of them had ever encountered. And it was enough. It was, in every way, abundantly and completely enough.